Once upon a time, there was a girl named Henrietta Lacks who had a knot inside her womb. She didn't know it at that time, but that knot would eventually become a line of immortal cells that would help to cure polio, experience nuclear bombs, and travel to the moon. Henrietta Lacks, born Loretta Pleasant, though nobody knows how she became Henrietta, grew up a poor black woman on a tobacco farm in Clover, Virginia. She was 4 years old when she moved to the tobacco farm to live with her grandfather when her mother died, giving birth to her 10th child in 1924. Henrietta grew up with her cousin David Lacks, called Day, and as they grew older, they became closer and closer, and on April 10th, 1941, Henrietta married Day. The two began having children, and after their 4th child, sex began hurting for Henrietta. She began to feel what she described as a knot in her womb. But after about a week, she turned up pregnant with her 5th child, Joe. About 4.5 months after Joe was born, Henrietta had blood spotting her underwear when she shouldn't be on her period. She filled the bathtub with warm water and slid a finger inside herself. She rubbed her finger around her cervix until she found a hard lump the size of a marble just to the left of the opening into her uterus. Henrietta told her husband to take her to the doctor. The doctor tested the lump for syphilis, but the test came back negative, so he told her to go to the Johns Hopkins Gynecology Clinic. Day drove Henrietta 20 miles to get there because it was the only major hospital around that treated black patients. Henrietta was examined by Howard Jones, who found the lump right where she said it was. He described the lump as a hard mass the size of a nickel, shiny and purple like grape jello, and so delicate it bled at the slightest touch. Jones cut a small sample and sent it to the pathology lab for diagnosis. His notes about Henrietta and the diagnosis state: her history is interesting in that she had a term delivery here at the hospital, September 19th, 1950. No note is made at the history at the time or in the 6 weeks return visit that there is any abnormality of the cervix. This means that in 3 weeks, Henrietta's cancer had grown into a fully fledged tumor. Henrietta was diagnosed with epidermoid carcinoma of the cervix, stage 1. Cervical carcinomas are divided into 2 types: invasive carcinomas, which have penetrated the surface of the cervix, and non-invasive carcinomas, which have not. Most doctors in 1951 believed invasive carcinomas were deadly and non-invasive were not, so they treated invasive aggressively and didn't worry about non-invasive. But Howard Jones' boss, Richard Wesley Taylindi, believed non-invasive carcinoma was an earlier stage of invasive carcinoma. Taylindi was conducting a study on this subject and was using Johns Hopkins Hospital as a source for the cancerous tissue for the research with the help of George Guy, head of tissue research at Johns Hopkins. On February 5, 1951, Henrietta got a call from Jones saying that her lump was malignant. That night she told Day that she had to go back to the doctor for more tests and medicine. When she arrived at the hospital, she signed a form that said, "I hereby give consent to the staff of Johns Hopkins Hospital to perform any operative procedures and under any anesthetic, either local or general, that they may deem necessary in the proper surgical care and treatment of Henrietta Lacks," she signed. A witness signed the bottom of the form, and Henrietta signed another. With Henrietta unconscious, Dr. Lawrence Orton Jr. dilated her cervix, and without Henrietta knowing that Taylindi was collecting a sample or having asked her if she wanted to be a donor, Wharton shaved 2 pieces of cervix from Henrietta's cervix, one from her healthy tissue, one from her tumor. He placed the pieces in a dish. Wharton then slipped a tube of radium into her cervix and packed another plaque against it. He put several rolls of gauze into her vagina to keep the radium in place. He threaded a catheter into her bladder so she could urinate without disturbing the radium treatment. He wrote on one sheet of paper, "The patient tolerated the procedure well and left the operating room in good condition." On a different sheet of paper, he wrote, "Henrietta Lacks, biopsy of cervical tissue, tissue given to Dr. George Guy." Henrietta spent the 2 days after her treatment in the hospital. Before she left the hospital, the doctor removed the radium and gave her instructions to call if she had any problems and to come back in 2.5 weeks for her next radium treatment. Henrietta's tissue samples had been cut into squares and dropped onto chicken blood clots at the bottom of test tubes by George Guy's assistant, Mary Kupasek. She labeled the cultures as she did all samples that came her way, with the first 2 letters of the patient's first and last name. He, Law. 2 days after Henrietta went home from the hospital, Mary saw what looked like rings of fried egg at the bottom of the test tube. The cells were growing, and by the next day they had doubled. The cells grew to fill any space Mary gave them. The cancerous cells grew 20 times faster than Henrietta's normal cells, which died after a few days. Soon Guy told some of his closest colleagues that he may have grown the first immortal cells. They asked if they could have some. He said yes. Henrietta went back to Hopkins once for a second radium treatment and checkup. The doctors were pleased with how the treatment was going. The tumor was shrinking. However, she had to start X-ray therapy, which meant she had to go to Hopkins every weekday for a month. The treatment was going well. The tumor vanished. The doctors wrote, but towards the end of her treatment, Henrietta found out that the radium treatment had left her infertile. The doctors wrote, told she could not have any more children, says that if she had been told before, she would have not gone through with treatment. By the time Henrietta found out, it was too late. 3 weeks after starting X-ray therapy, her urine came out feeling like broken glass, and she now had acute gonorrhea superimposed on a radiation reaction. Henrietta began to feel worse and worse. One day, Henrietta lifted her shirt to show her best friends Margaret and Sadie the effect of the radiation treatment. The skin from her breasts to her pelvis was charred deep black from radiation. Sadie gasped. "Henny, they burnt you black as tar." Henrietta nodded and said, "Lord, it feels like that blackness be spreading all inside me." By September of 1951, Henrietta's body was almost totally taken over by tumors. They had grown on her diaphragm and lungs. They blocked her intestines and took over her kidneys so that she could no longer filter the toxins from her body. On September 24th, the doctors discontinued all medications except pain medications. Before she died, Henrietta turned to her sister Gladys and whispered, "You make sure Day takes care of them children." Henrietta Lacks died at 12:15 a.m. on October 4th, 1951. Meanwhile, George Guy was shipping HeLa cells to every scientist who asked for them. Scientists began using Henrietta's cells to make huge discoveries in genetics and biology. Scientists in Colorado cloned an individual cell from the HeLa line to harness the specific trait of the cell. In 1953, geneticists accidentally mixed the wrong liquid with HeLa cells, which caused the chromosomes to spread out, allowing scientists to see them clearly for the first time. In 1951, the United States of America was in the middle of a polio crisis, and in 1952, Jonas Salk announced that he had discovered a vaccine, but he couldn't begin offering it until he had tested it on a large scale and knew it was safe to use on children. In order to do this, he needed a large quantity of cells. However, most cells only grew in a single layer on a glass surface, which was tedious and labor-intensive to grow the amount of cells Salk needed. Luckily, HeLa cells were less picky than other cells. They could grow floating in a culture medium that was constantly stirred by a magnetic device, which was called growing in suspension. HeLa cells were also more susceptible to poliovirus. The abundance of HeLa cells allowed Salk to test his vaccine and save thousands of white children's lives using a black woman's body. HeLa cells were put into space to study the effects of zero gravity on human cells. HeLa cells were used to develop drugs for treating herpes, influenza, and Parkinson's disease. Because of the abundance of cells, scientists were able to use them without hesitation to perform experiments and make huge scientific discoveries. A huge profit was made off of Henrietta's cells. Neither she or her family received any of that profit or had any knowledge that her cells were used for the discoveries of vaccinations and drugs that would be sold to thousands of people. The rediscovery of the story of Henrietta Lacks has raised important questions about racial inequality and informed consent. Hopefully, these questions allow us to create a more equal society.